So here's my question. Who wrote Hamlet? Well, you say William Shakespeare. But really that presupposes two ideas. The first is it presupposes that Shakespeare wrote Hamlet. And it also presupposes that Shakespeare ever existed. Because there is a lot of modern scholarship that argues that there was no William Shakespeare, that it was a pen name of another writer, and that all the poems and plays attributed to Shakespeare were actually written by somebody else. Maybe you're not aware of this. I'm just full of fun facts tonight. Amerigo Vespucci, the great Italian explorer, was probably a pickle salesman who may have never gotten on a boat and traveled to the New World. And rather, when a man was drawing a map of the New World, it was unnamed, lent his name to the map, and now we have the Americas, half the world, named for a man who may have never seen it. And even worse, he's really only mentioned in 4 existing documents, one or two of which are letters that he supposedly wrote, where his name is actually there, so that others actually now are wondering, did he ever truly exist? It makes you think. And questions like these are important, but not of the variety of life and death. I mean, if you don't believe in Amerigo Vespucci, people might think you're weird, but they're not going to say you ought to die for that. It's important for you to know that when we talk about Jesus, now that's life and death, isn't it? That means something. There's eternal value here. But when we talk about Jesus, there are 2 Jesuses that people talk about. There's the Jesus of the Bible. That's the Jesus we believe in. And then there's the Jesus of people who profess to be Christian in some way, but actually do not believe in the Jesus of the Bible. So the Jesus that we believe in, pray to, sing about, is different from the Jesus that they think of when they write the term or speak the name Jesus. In fact, I would say it this way. Christianity has a problem of competing and contradicting Jesuses. Let me give you an example. In the 18th century, in the rise of theological liberalism in Europe, which is, by the way, Europe is now today post-Christian society, there began to be questions about Jesus as he is presented in the Bible. And in many ways, what is called the first quest of the historical Jesus, then that ends with Albert Schweitzer. And then you have the second quest for the historical Jesus, and that ended. And now we are in the middle of, or the end of, the third quest of the historical Jesus, as I'll talk about in a moment. But Jesus was totally reinvented. His history, his identity, and his theological significance. So at the first quest of a historical Jesus, for example, Hermann Reimarus argued that Christianity, all of it, was just based on a mistake. That actually Jesus wasn't what we think of when we think of Jesus, but was really just a Jewish revolutionary. And that what we know as Christianity today is based upon the creation of his disciples after Jesus died. Later scholars argued that Jesus was more of a figure, a type. The most influential theologian of the 20th century was a German by the name of Rudolf Bultmann. And Bultmann was not a conservative by any stretch. He was probably not a believer by any stretch. He said Jesus is really more of a commentary on the lives of early Christians and not really a historical person. So thus, the Jesus that the apostles preached is really different from the Jesus of history. Do you understand the difference? Does that make sense to you? We have to nail this point down, because everything we're going to talk about after this is going to deal with history and not with necessarily the other. So the Jesus the apostles preached, that's the one we have in our Bible. But they would say there's a different Jesus, the Jesus of history. So there was a person who lived in Palestine somewhere around the time of our Bible Jesus, and he was named Jesus, and he was killed by the Romans, and that's about as much as we know about this historical Jesus. That's the liberal point of view. There's a group called the Jesus Seminar. How many of you have ever heard of the Jesus Seminar? It's led by a guy named Robert Funk. In fact, Funk may be dead now. I'm not sure. But he was the leader of this group. And he is considered a New Testament scholar. And the Jesus Seminar gets together, or used to get together, in their quest to determine who the real Jesus is. And they would vote. And they had pink pebbles and gray pebbles and white pebbles. And if something was accurate in the Gospels, they would throw one color pebble in, and if they weren't sure, they'd throw another color pebble in. And if it was absolutely certain that it wasn't true, they would throw another color pebble in. And so after they went through the entire New Testament, or at least the Gospels rather, they came to the end, and they said that only 18% of our Gospels is accurate. The other 72% is not trustworthy, not reliable, inaccurate. Then later, after them, a theologian actually from our area, Bart Ehrman from the University of North Carolina. He wears Carolina blue and cheers on his Tar Heels like yesterday. I don't think he's part of the Jesus Seminar, but he is really popular in liberal theological circles. Ehrman is a New Testament scholar, particularly in the early church. And Bart Ehrman actually has claimed that the Christianity that we have is actually the Christianity that won the battle between two competing Christianities. The Christianity that's real Christianity is what we call Gnosticism. And our Christianity beat out Gnosticism and destroyed their libraries and that kind of thing. By the way, there was a find in the 20th century at a place in Egypt, I think it's called Nag Hammadi, and we found a whole bunch of Gnostic writings. Many of them have been translated into English, so you can read things like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, and these kinds of things. And Ehrman has popularized actually an idea that was proposed by another German scholar. In fact, he's stolen all of his work. His name is Walter Bauer. And Bauer had this idea. Ehrman has stolen Bauer's idea, popularized it, so now it's the Bauer-Ehrman theory, but it's really Bauer's theory that Ehrman has just made into the mainstream. That these Christianities are different, and the Christianity that we're talking about that has a Bible like ours is completely wrong, and there's another Christianity altogether. But part of doing that, Ehrman, who is now a self-professed agnostic, Ehrman says that the Gospels that we have in our Bible were not written by the Gospel writers. So Matthew didn't write Matthew, Luke didn't write Luke, Mark didn't write Mark, and John certainly didn't write John. And if it was a guy named John, it wasn't John the Apostle. It was some John the Elder or some other John who came in much later, but probably not even anybody named John. But the bottom line is what we have people criticizing the Bible as being historically unreliable. That's their argument. That when you read your Bible, you're not actually reading anything historically reliable, so that when you read about Jesus and his life, probably none of that happened. He did die, but he probably didn't rise from the dead. In fact, they would say he didn't rise from the dead, but if he rose from the dead, it's not an actual physical resurrection. It's some sort of spiritual resurrection. In fact, most people within the liberal wing of the United Methodist Church, which is the main of that denomination, believe Jesus didn't rise physically from the dead. It was just a spiritual resurrection from the dead. But of all that liberalism that's questioning the Bible and throwing all this mud at what we believe, there is one thing that is almost universally agreed upon, and this is what to me is very interesting. Almost everybody believes Jesus was crucified. Now we have on our wall a cross. People wear crosses around their necks. They have crosses in their house. And it's not a symbol that has any grace. We don't get special spiritual kind of magic from the cross that hangs on our wall. It's a symbol of something to us that's very important. It means something to us. And you go across the world and you find crosses, and these crosses mean something. There's something important about a cross. It has meaning for us. And I find that when we're defending our faith, I have to really work hard sometimes to defend my belief in the resurrection with people who are unbelievers, who've been trained in all of the arguments against the resurrection. And I find it difficult sometimes to argue against things like the virgin birth. There are people out there writing books. A man wrote a book called Velvet Jesus, and he questioned the virgin birth. He said it could just have been as likely that Jesus was born and his mother was Mary, but his father was named Steve. And you struggle to direct your comments and arguments against people who argue against the virgin birth. And you can argue all these different aspects of Jesus' life, but you get to the death of Jesus, and everybody is almost universally certain Jesus died, and he died on a cross. To me, that makes it very important, because while we believe the death of Jesus by crucifixion by the Romans, and the liberal scholars believe that Jesus died by the Romans, we are then within a realm of absolute historical certainty. So remember, I divided the two. I've got the Bible. We absolutely believe, I hope you believe the Bible. I believe the Bible. I don't want you to get confused and think, well, our pastor now doesn't believe the Bible. No. Believe the Bible. I believe the Bible over history. Okay? You can write a history that may or may not be true, but I believe the Bible. What I'm saying is that when you go to the realm of history, we're actually now walking in a place of absolute historical certainty. That it's universally agreed upon by people who have for centuries been picking apart every aspect of Jesus' life. I mean, they have criticized every part of his life. And there are some things to criticize, the paintings of Jesus with long hair, because they thought they misunderstand the verse that says, he shall be called a Nazarene. And they say, well, he was from Nazareth, and they get confused about the Nazarite vow. So Jesus had hair down to his feet, this kind of thing. There's a lot of confusion, or that basically he looks like he's from Sweden. You have those paintings of Jesus, blue eyes and blonde hair kind of thing. Obviously, he's Jewish, he's Middle Eastern, he doesn't look like that, and in fact, he doesn't probably look like most of the paintings depict him to be. There are some things that you can criticize, but of the whole, their criticisms are false and wrong. But here we agree. Jesus died on a cross. And because of that agreement, we have something where we can all say, even if you don't think Matthew wrote Matthew, and Mark wrote Mark, and Luke wrote Luke, and John wrote John, here's the thing. My Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all have a Jesus dying on a cross, and you believe that. We all agree that this is true. And that makes it very interesting. And I'm going to share with you some conclusions at the end, but let's begin first. That historically, we're just looking at this historically, just going to read this story like we would as a history story. The very first thing we find is that Jesus was crucified at a particular place. So this is the kind of things historians are looking for. Where did it happen? They want to know something about what's going on. So they're looking at this, and you look at verse 33, that they were come to the place, that is, the Romans are leading the procession. They bring Jesus to the place that is called Calvary. We also call it Golgotha. But the word Calvary here is significant. We'll get to that in a moment. And they crucified him, and the malefactors, the criminals, one on the right hand, one on the left. Now, the practice of the Romans is to lead the criminals outside the city gates to a place of execution. And they would have the criminals carry the cross beam. Now, it wasn't necessarily important that it was in the shape of a T, a lowercase t or an uppercase t, and there's some debate over that. I personally think Jesus was crucified on a cross similar to the one we have on our wall, where it looks like a lowercase t, but you can argue something different. That's fine. Some people believe it was like an X. Some people believe that it was in different shapes. Whatever you believe there, that's fine. I'm going to kind of go with lowercase t, because he has something nailed to the cross above his head. And an uppercase T wouldn't leave you the room, the wooden space to nail the document. So I kind of go with the lowercase t. And they take the victim to this very visible place. And in the place in Jerusalem where you go to, the idea is that there were these two large intersections, or thoroughfares, that intersect. So you have a giant intersection, and so what you'd think of is a lot of foot traffic, a lot of animals. There's a lot of people milling about. They go to that place, and they call the location Calvary. Now, this will probably interest you to know that the Greek word Calvary, what we translate Calvary, is the word cranium or cranion, and it actually means skull. You have inside under the skin, I hope you have one of these. You have a skull, right? That you have a cranium. This is the word cranion, and is it describing the physical features of that place? That's what a guy named Gordon thought. At Gordon's Calvary, you go there. Some of you have been to Gordon's Calvary, and you look and you can actually see what looks to be like a skull. I'm not sure that 2,000 years of all the wear and tear that wind and water do on a place would leave the rock formation exactly as it looked. And by the way, the Crusades and all the other things that went on there, I'm not sure that it's going to still look exactly the same. So I actually don't know if Gordon's Calvary is the right place. Nobody is really fully certain. But in Luke's day, they would have known. And that's the point. When Luke says it's the place of the skull, everyone would have gone, oh yeah, it's the place of the skull. Some of you who live around here in this area, you'll go, oh man, I remember, did you live here back when? And they'll tell about a store or something used to be. When I go to Greenville, South Carolina, where I grew up, drive through the town, I go, oh yeah, there used to be a movie theater there, and there used to be an ice cream place there, and everything's changed. You know, the Kmart where I used to run away from my mom and then tell the lady, I don't know where my mom is, and then they would shout her name over the loudspeaker. And she thinks I did this on purpose just to embarrass her. That's now no longer, the strip mall is still there, but it's something totally different. It's a different store. Well, I think Luke's people, in Luke's day, Luke's audience would have said, oh yeah, I know exactly where you're talking about. So to his people, in his day, when it's being written and people are reading it for the first time, here's a place, it's a real place, we know exactly where it is. That's a historical fact. You can kind of hang your hat on that. Not only is the place of Jesus' death a real location, but we also have his death witnessed by numerous people from different walks of life. His death was attended by 8 separate groups of people. And I want you to notice the differences both in ethnicity and occupation. From a Jewish perspective, Luke records all of the people who witnessed Jesus' death. You have the people of Jerusalem in verse 35 and verse 48. You have the rulers of the Jews, again at the end of verse 35. You have the criminals who are beside Jesus. And while they witnessed the death of Jesus, they're not around later to testify of it, right? Because they're also dying on crosses. That's verse 39 to 43. Then you have the women, and they're mentioned here twice, verse 49 and then later in verse 55. And they are witnesses of what's going on. And then you have Joseph of Arimathea, who is probably not at the cross during the time of death, but he actually takes Jesus' body off of the cross. So clearly Joseph is aware of his death. And throw in here Nicodemus, because while Nicodemus isn't mentioned in Luke, Nicodemus is actually around. Now, it's interesting that the two people who take care of Jesus' body and bury Jesus' body in Joseph's tomb are 2 members of the Sanhedrin who voted to crucify Jesus, to put him to death, but they refused to cast their vote and actually are a little bit afraid of the Jews, so they kind of go into hiding until after Jesus is dead. And it's interesting that Nicodemus is one of them. So you get John 3, you got Nicodemus showing up, and here at the end, you got Nicodemus again. And you have Joseph of Arimathea, who doesn't really show up until this point. But it's interesting that some of these Pharisees are coming to faith. And after Jesus rises from the dead, many of them will come to faith. There are also Gentile witnesses. Because Luke is not writing just for Jews, he's writing also for Gentiles. And the Gentile witnesses, you have things like the soldiers, verse 33 and 36. You've got a centurion in verse 47. And then you have Pilate. And how is Pilate a witness? Because Joseph comes and says, I need to take down the body. And Pilate says, okay. Pilate is aware, at least by referent, Pilate is aware that Jesus is dead because they're taking his body off of the cross. Now consider the various occupations of the witnesses. You have government employees. Yeah, those are the soldiers. These are not insignificant because class is a big deal to these people who are reading Luke's gospel. While our culture has tried to destroy classes, when I say class, I mean upper class, middle class, lower class. We want to destroy class distinctions. Nobody's better than the other. I kind of understand where they're coming from. We all are created equal. That's in one of our founding documents. But they're destroying class. But in this culture, there was class. And so you have government employees. That's considered kind of a middle class person. You have religious leaders like priests. These are rulers of the Jews. They're considered in more of an upper class. And then you have criminals. What kind of class would they be in? The criminal class. Probably a lower class, right? In our culture, we elect them to office. Anyway, just a little political joke there. If we could erase that from later. Then you have a centurion. He's kind of like middle management, right? And then you have a housewife, a whole bunch of housewives, and that's the women who are mentioned. And then you have a businessman, Joseph of Arimathea, and then you have a politician who's Pilate. You have people from all different classes, all different ethnicities that are watching and taking in and witnessing this. And the importance of these witnesses is that their testimony confirms each other across class and ethnic divides. In other words, if this was just one class of people and one ethnicity saying this is what we saw and heard, someone else might criticize that and say, well, that's because, look at that, that's where they're coming from. I mean, the people who witnessed this were all from Jesus' family. They were from Nazareth, or they were all just Jews and they're supporting this, or just Jesus' followers. But this crosses over class, crosses over ethnicity. So much so, this is so certain eyewitness testimony that we have absolute certainty now that Jesus died on the cross. Moreover, the sources of these testimonies, the Gospels, includes people like women and soldiers and criminals. And if you're a historian writing in the first century, you would never include them to support your position. Why? Because nobody thought criminals and women and soldiers, and I'm sorry, ladies, you're put in the same class as these others, are to be trusted. They would consider them to be people who lie, especially in such a male-centric world as is the first century of Jesus' time. So by including Pilate and the centurion, no Jewish historian would think their testimony is trustworthy. But by doing that, actually what he's doing is he's compounding one testimony on top of another, on top of another, on top of another, so that we come to a place where we say, this is absolutely certain. Now, the place of Jesus' death is certain. To lead the original audience, they would have known where that was. And not only is the fact of his death a certainty, but the impact now of his death is so important, because if we all agree that the Jesus of the Bible and the Jesus of history at least intersect at this one point, if the whole world agrees, then what's the significance of that fact? And I would say this, the death of Jesus is vital to our faith. It's the crux. We're right in this story. It's preparing us for the next piece of this, which is the resurrection. That's also part of our apologetic. But the death of Jesus is so important to this. This is the first part of the gospel. You remember the gospel, right? Jesus died for our sins, 1 Corinthians 15, 3 and 4. He was buried and he rose again from the dead. And so here we have the crux, which is, by the way, we get our word cross, crucifixion, crux. We have the center of our faith right here. And it's a historical certainty. It's an historical fact that isn't even denied that Jesus died on a cross. First, it confirms the person of Jesus as being different from normal humans. You have first, in verse 34, an Old Testament prophecy being fulfilled where it said in the Old Testament that they would cast lots for his clothing. And this is exactly what you see. They're casting lots for his clothing. Then you see this connection between Jesus and a Jewish crown, that Jesus would be a king. And all of these ideas in the Old Testament, particularly in the prophets, of a coming king. You read Isaiah, and you find this urging, this yearning for a king, all through the Old Testament, but particularly the prophets. And if you read the Jewish Old Testament, which ends with 2 Chronicles, and you get to the end, you have this really rotten king named Jeconiah. And the names get a little confusing there. But he's just terrible. They have these terrible kings at the end. And you read all these king names, and you just go, they're rotten, they're rotten, they're rotten, they're terrible, they're really bad. And then 400 years of silence, and then the king is born. And so you have here the connection between Jesus and the Jewish crown. Secondly, not only did it confirm the person of Jesus as being different from normal humans, that is, he is deity, it accomplished the divine purpose for his crucifixion. One of the first things you see in this text is Jesus forgiving people. He says, Father, forgive them. They don't even know what they're doing. Paul's going to write later in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, or the end of chapter 1, I think it's chapter 2, that if they had known what they were doing, the Romans, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. The Jews knew what they were doing. The Romans didn't. They just thought they were just crucifying another man, another person. His death meets the requirements of God's purging from sin, verses 44 through 46, as the wrath of God is being poured out on Jesus, is being emptied out on him as he's on the cross. And then it accomplished. It meets God's standard with no taint of sin. As you find this Roman centurion saying, surely he was an innocent man. As you find the criminal hanging next to him on the cross, we indeed justly, but this man is innocent. And then third, by confirming his burial, a major fact of the story is confirmed. This is the sign that Jesus talks about in Matthew 24. It's called the sign of the prophet Jonah. He says before he dies, even as Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days, guess where I'm going to be for 3 days? I'm going to be in the earth. My body's going to be in the earth. It's a place that has been generally located. If you go to the Holy Land today, they'll take you to where they believe Jesus was buried. Is that absolutely the place? There isn't complete certainty, but there's a lot of arguments that are very strong that you're actually looking at the place where Jesus was buried. And then it sets up the second part of this important historical truth. Because all of this, friends, if you're following this story and you believe that Jesus died on the cross and you believe that he was buried, now we have just a short step to the next truth that is the crux of our faith, the center of our faith. Jesus died, was buried, and he rose again. And this is what's really cool. If you talk to your neighbor about Jesus, he may disagree with you about a lot of things about Jesus, but he'll say, oh yeah, Jesus died. He died on a cross. Sure, he was crucified. Nearly everyone believes this. It's just a short step to say, but did he rise again? Because once we're there, we're at the gospel. We're at the heart of what we believe. So I guess my question is, do you believe it? Do you believe that Jesus died on a cross about 2,000 years ago outside of Jerusalem at the hands of the Romans because of the Jewish leaders turning him over to them? You say, sure, Pastor, I believe that. I mean, I told you, people wonder about Shakespeare, they wonder about Amerigo Vespucci, and I think you hear stories like that, people go, oh, come on. Everybody knows there was a Shakespeare. Everybody knows there was Vespucci. My wife likes a podcast, The Way I Heard It, by Mike Rowe. I'll end with this. He recently had an episode about a man named Henry Heimlich. You know Heimlich, don't you? Invented the Heimlich maneuver. It's kind of when someone's choking, you reach around behind them, and you kind of press on their abdomen forcefully in an upward motion, and it dislodges whatever's in their mouth or in their throat. It's been used to save thousands of people's lives. The only problem is Heimlich was a fraud. He took credit for his office mate's discovery and invention, and took and put his name on the maneuver and stole it. In fact, nearly everything about Henry Heimlich was a fraud, and it wasn't discovered until after he died, and his son decided to write a biography on his dad. And his son Peter starts writing this story and realizes everything about my dad was wrong. He was a terrible doctor. He didn't invent the Heimlich maneuver. It shouldn't be named for him. It should be named something else. But this is the great thing about our faith. It's real. It's absolutely real. And better, we can prove it. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you, Lord, that what we're believing is not unattestable. It's not just blind.